Alright, welcome back. Today we're going to talk a lot about lighting. I'm going to cut this into like a few parts, so it's all going to be like little parts of specific things. So first things first, let's talk a little bit about the sun. So if you don't know what the sun is, let's say we might muted it. We don't have a light source, and we need a light source, and one of the main of the three light source is actually this world's light source. The world light source would be your sun and the moon. So first let's just talk a little bit about the sun. This engine has the ability to create an artificial sun which allows simulation for lights. Now there's a few settings over here that we're going to talk about. The first setting is going to be the temperature. We have the ability to make a classic and a temperature style color mode. Now this is just defines what type of values we have. So in terms of classic mode is just pure color, while temperature is the what do you call it, the difference between the hue in terms of how hot it is. So in color mode, we don't really have a hue scale, we just have an intensity scale, which means how strong is this light gonna be. So if we were to make it just 1, which is just 1-to-1 ratio, and we were to change a color to it, it's gonna give us a color that's exactly what we needed. But as you can see, I chose neon and it gave us a gives us like a pinkish color. So once we make it to 2 or probably even 5, we get the exact same color that we need, and that looks like a little funky color, but if your game's like that, then your game's like that. I'm gonna keep it back to 1, and I'm gonna change the temperature to color mode to temperature. Now temperature actually has a temperature source. This is for your hue saturation mixes. Now if it goes under let's see 5,000, it's going to go into the negative values of that color, or more into the reddish side, while the heavier it goes more into the bluish. So if we just go faster, it goes more into the blue hue, while the colder goes into the red. Doesn't make sense, but live with it for now. So for temperature, the best thing to do is just keep it at like, I don't know, 15,000 or something, somewhere in the middle. The intensity, again, how strong or how weak you want it. We're just gonna keep it to 3, makes it easier. And then we're gonna go into scattering. Scattering has 3 options. One is none, the other one is the sun that we use by default, and the moon. None basically means that there's no sky, but the coloring of the reflection of the celestial body reflects off to the ground. The sun is your regular sun, and then the moon is actually the reflection of the moon. Now let me just go back to the sun and go down here and talk a little bit about all these settings that we have. The shadows is the shadows. Right now we don't have a shadow on this guy because I disabled it from the character itself, but if I were to create a random box just somewhere here, let me get him up here and go back to the sun and decide to remove shadows. Now all objects inside this world do not reflect shadows, but we're going to turn it back on. I'm going to delete that, and then go back here. Cascades actually decide about how much reflection or how many cuts between the shadows there are going to be. So first, before we even do any of these settings, let's go back to our character and actually enable shadows for the character. And the way to do that is to go onto the character, click on him, go down until you get to the surfaces, and click on that middle one that says cast world shadows, and now it casts a world shadow. So we go back to the sunlight, and the number of cascades is the number of breakout or reflection differences inside the shadow. You can play around with it. I think the best one's always like around 2ish, and it just shows you how much you want to break it. Now you have the bias and the normal biases. What this does is how far or how close the shadow is compared to the object itself. So if the bias is really far away, the shadow is going to be a little far away from the main point of contact from where the shadow goes in. So if I were to just go in here, look at his feet, you can see that the shadow is not even touching his heel, but rather it's already here. So if we were to remove the bias, you will see that it hits onto the heel exactly like how it's supposed to be, realistically speaking. A little bit of bias doesn't matter. Now the normal bias, on the other hand, is how much, if we zoom in just a little bit, how strong the change of the shadow with the light is. So it has to do with the blurring between the object's body. So if we go over here, look over here, and we just drop this down to like a 0, you'll notice that the blur got very strong. But the higher we get it, the more there's a discrepancy, or there's a difference between light and shadow. So I'm just going to keep it somewhere here so it looks, or probably just make it full so it looks like it actually has a hard cut. And that's the main one. Now for filters, you'll notice one thing. If we change the filters, it'll work, but if we change the penumbra, it doesn't work. Now for this, we actually have to go into settings, the main settings over here. We gotta go click on the shadows. And once we click on the shadows, we're gonna go over here and into the penumbra mode, and we're just gonna keep it into, I think high works the best, so we're just gonna keep it in high. Alright, once we do that, we go back into our main light source that we have here, and now we can actually change the penumbra, and it basically deflects and refracts our object the way we want it to. So in our case, right now we have the penumbra to 0. That means there's no cuts between the shadows. The moment we add some, we have some split within the light. And then you could also filter it so it can show how much difference there is. Right now, I guess that looks pretty nice. I guess. For display, it's pretty good. Screen space shadows. We're not gonna see any of this until we go in here and we press screen space shadow. But the problem with screen space shadows is it takes a lot of performance. So right now you look at my FPS and it's about 300. The moment I turn it on and then I turn it on here, we dropped the FPS just by a tiny bit, and that is just one object. Now imagine if I had 100 objects and we had screen space shadows. Now what screen space shadows basically is let me go back in here, is basically the rendering of shadows from far away. So while we were here, that was the main shadow that we had rendering from the sun. But the moment we got to a certain point, now we have a screen space shadow, a smaller shadow that takes over and shows us what it would look like, or like a dot in that space, telling us from far away that there's an object there. That's what screen space shadows are. Now we could always increase the rays and increase the steps, but that is where things can get really wonky with the performance. So we're just gonna keep it at 3 rays and about 25 steps, and it should be the most effective that it could ever be. Then you could just play around with the settings to see if it works nicely or if it doesn't, and just play around with it. And yeah, I'm gonna turn it back off and turn it off from here because I don't need it, it's too much. And then once we go back in here, we have one more setting, and that would be the lens flare, and that is the basic lens flare. You could choose specific lens flare colors and everything, but for now we're just gonna choose the basic lens flare that we have. And just play around with it, and that's it. We can also choose light colors or not, but the default settings that they gave us is more than enough for an actual proper lens flare. And that's it for the sun. We're gonna talk next about the other ones.